Well, shalom, y'all. In this world, it's often who you know or how much money you have. And if you have a lot of money, you typically know more people. So we try to control our circumstances by using our friends or using our influence to get what we want. God works in a different way. God works from the bottom up. And in 2 Kings 5, we're going to see how God takes a conquered country. Israel has been conquered by Aram, and he uses a slave girl and he uses servants to have an enormous impact on the general of the army that conquered Israel. So let's join Debbie as she talks about 2 Kings 5 and the story of a cured leper.
All right, so we are shifting, yes, to 2 Kings. And to start this morning, I'm not setting a timer on my phone. I'm not getting messages, that kind of thing. I'm trying to, rather than flip back and forth between the iPad story and this, and that way I'm where I need to be in both places. I saw a story, I don't know how many of y'all saw the news this week, about the guy in Indiana, the pizza delivery guy. He's 25 years old, and he's being hailed as a hero for running into a burning house, and he rescued 5 children. I mean, it was crazy. He was making a delivery. It was 12:30. He's driving in the, not 12:30, it was 12:30 at night. And he was driving by and noticed this house was on fire. And so he ran into the house and he found 4 of the children, and those children were between 1 and 18. And he got those 4 children out, and they, and the kids were telling him that there was another one inside. And so he went back into the house. He heard the child crying, and so he eventually found her, but the smoke was so thick that he was having a hard time. He couldn't find the back door. And so they ended up, he couldn't find the stairs to get down to the back door. So they jumped from an upstairs window. And all the children are fine. He's fine. And he just said that, you know, he said, I just had to do it. I had to do something. And sometimes we have people who are heroes who are very unlikely heroes. I mean, the pizza delivery guy runs in, and y'all, there were firemen out there. There were firemen out there. And the pizza delivery guy got there first. For the second child, he ran in, and the firemen were there. So I want you to keep that in mind, the idea that sometimes God kind of works from the bottom up. You know, the pizza guy goes in instead of the trained guy, and ends up being the person who's responsible for saving the life. Because we've got a situation like that with the story of Naaman in chapter 5 that we're going to be taking a look at today. All right, so 2 Kings chapter 5 is where we're going to be. I'm going to disappear for just a minute, put my phone away so I don't end up knocking it on the floor. I had to make sure I had my facts straight with the story. Well, with the story.
That never stopped you.
I know, I could just make it up. That's right. Yeah, I just make it up. All right. So we know that we have been talking about Elijah previously. He's been training Elisha to take his place. And that always confused me as a kid until I realized, okay, J comes before S. That's all I have to do is remember Elijah was first and Elisha was second. So Elisha is prophet in training. And at this point, Elijah has been taken away in the fiery chariot to heaven. And so Elisha is now the prophet in Israel. The kings in Israel still are bad. They don't like God's prophets still. So those things have not changed. We've shifted to Elisha, though. So when we start in chapter 5, we're going to take a look first at verses 1-3. Then we're introduced to a man who is kind of a bigwig, but not a bigwig in Israel, but in the conquering army of Aram. Okay. Now, Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now, bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So we get to meet Naaman, and we know some things about him as far as his reputation. He is a commander. He is very successful. It says that he's valiant, so he's got courage. It says that he's highly regarded. That means that people esteem him, they hold him, they put him up on a pedestal. You know, I keep thinking of, do you remember years ago, Norman Schwarzkopf? Remember how everybody, and Colin Powell, they had those men on a pedestal because they were men who had been successful. They carried themselves with a certain demeanor that had confidence, and they had a humility about them too that just showed leadership. So they were not only competent, they were confident. And I kind of think, okay, so Naaman might be the equivalent, all right, for his kingdom. But there's one big thing that he has that's a problem, and that's leprosy. And obviously, you know, we think COVID is bad as far as trying to quarantine and keep away from people. Leprosy doesn't, that COVID doesn't hold a candle in terms of the social stigma that it has. Okay, so we know that this is something that would have been devastating to him as far as relationships with other people, about his ability to do his job. So it's just going to have some long-reaching consequences that he has this. Now, I think there's a really interesting part of verse 1 that jumps out and says that this is not a coincidence or a coinky-dink, as one of my friends would say. It's not a coinky-dink that Naaman has leprosy. Because look at what it says. Because through him, the Lord had given victory to Aram. And so what does that tell us about God's hand in terms of Naaman and what's happened in Israel? Because Israel has been conquered. Who's responsible? God. God's hand is all of this. He's already tapped Naaman and said, I'm going to use you as an instrument. So we've seen that already in terms of his judgment on Israel. And now we see a circumstance where Naaman's had this horrible disease crop up. And it's like, God's put something else out on the table to show how he's using Naaman and to make a difference in Naaman and in his connections. Okay, so we've got a little bit about Naaman. Now, we've got a second character that we meet, and it's this young girl, doesn't even get a name. But what do we know about her? She's been taken captive, okay? And she's been made a servant / slave to Naaman's wife. Now, it says young girl. chances are really good that this young girl is really kind of a victim of other people's decisions and circumstances. You know, we know that in that culture, women did not have much influence. Her age certainly indicated that she wouldn't have much influence. So whatever her circumstances were, she's been kind of the victim of other people's decisions and other people's actions. And it puts her in the place where she's really kind of suffering for the actions of others. Now, if you had been taken from your home and you were made to be a servant, what would be your attitude about your circumstances?
Wouldn't be wanting to heal my cat door.
Yes, right.
Oh, woe be unto anybody.
Yes. Well, that's what,
Maybe, sorry.
I mean, you'd be more likely to want to get even.
Say that all the time.
I mean, I think the human reaction would be like, well, you get yours. You should get leprosy. I'm glad to see God judging you. I think that's the normal human reaction. But what we see here is a very different reaction. And I think that says two things. I think that says something about this young girl. And I think it says something about Naaman and the household that he runs. Okay, because what does she do? One, she approaches her mistress, approaches Naaman's wife, and evidently felt okay about doing that. Which, again, if you think about what we hear about the hierarchy in terms of slave and servants in just about any culture, there's usually some timidity there and not a lot of openness in terms of making suggestions. And yet we see this young girl who is willing to approach her mistress. Now, we don't know, did God prompt her to? It doesn't really say that. But we know that God's hand has been in all of this throughout the story of Naaman. So chances are good. It's not even a chance, really. We know that God's intentions are good, and he put the right girl in the right place to do the right thing at the right time. Such a time as this, yeah.
Naaman's wife. I mean, here's a slave girl come in to make a recommendation. So she will certainly be involved also.
I think you're exactly right. And I think it's another reflection of, the man is the head of the household. All right, that's biblical. The man is the head of the household. And he sets the tone for the household. And I think this is a clear indication of the kind of tone that Naaman set in his household. Because the wife is open to the suggestion, and the wife is communicating with the husband in a way that we don't always see in some of these other biblical couples. Yes. Okay. Yeah. What did he have to lose? Absolutely. Unless, I don't know if you run it, there are some people whose pride, I mean, it absolutely trumps everything. And it's not, I was going to say it's not Bruce, right?
No, it's my brother.
Okay.
Older brother.
Okay. I mean, it's like, I'm not going to bend in order to save myself if it might hurt my dignity or reputation or whatever the case may be. Sure.
These two words that she starts with, if only. To me, that says a lot. It says she's wistful. If only my master would see the content. Okay, she's compassionate and she's wistful. And you don't be wistful about somebody that you didn't care about.
Right.
And if he, in fact, has set the tone, he has set compassion as in that household.
Mhm.
Everybody's getting listened to.
Yes,
Those words, if only, I don't know what they were in the Greek, or it meant the same thing. That's what it says.
well, and that's what I had on here. She showed concern for others. That's compassion. And I think you're exactly right, that's the tone that he has set in this household. There's something about his leadership that's translated from the battlefield into his home. So this is a man who has been consistent and has consistently gotten high regard from his soldiers, from the public, and from his servants. And because of that, this girl of faith, because she does demonstrate faith. She's got the faith that if he sees Elisha, if only, then he would be healed. So we've got the circumstance where this girl of faith feels confident enough to speak up and compassionate enough and isn't controlled by her circumstances. And so many times I think about how I'm controlled by my circumstances. And that is exactly the opposite of what God tells a Christian they should be. Because circumstances shouldn't be controlling us. The Holy Spirit should be controlling us. Because what are we to remember about circumstances? They're temporary, aren't they? They're going to change. And that doesn't always mean they get better. Sometimes they can get worse. But ultimately, we know for the believer that the circumstances are going to change ultimately in a way where we're in the presence of God. And he's got us in his hand, and he's authoring the story and is involved in our stories all along, just like he's involved in Naaman's story. So when the bad things come, and they will, I mean, it's not for a believer, definitely. It's not an if, it's a when. When the bad things come, then we can be confident that somehow God's going to use it for good and growing the kingdom. Now, our personal good in the way we define good in this time and place may be different than the way God defines good in this time and place. Just like the way that God defines a hero can be very different than the way the world defines a hero. You look at this little girl and you don't think, oh, that's the one to get the job done. But God sees someone who's obedient and faithful and positions them in a place to be able to get the job done. Just like the pizza delivery guy. God worked from the bottom up. And here, God's working from the bottom up. And we in the world, a lot of times, expect change to happen from the top down, or circumstances to be shifted from the top down. And that's not the way God works most of the time. I mean, even when we think about people that have been elevated to positions, if you think about Saul, if you think about David, they were taken from the bottom and placed at the top. They weren't born there. Most of the ones that are born there, what do we see in Kings over and over and over again? They fail. And it's because they lose sight of their allegiance to God, and they become so enamored of things like power or wealth a legacy even. But those from the bottom, God elevates, which kind of defies what we think the natural order should be. Okay. So what were the results or the consequences of this girl's bravery? Well, Naaman hears from his wife. Okay. So we know that Naaman's wife is going to share the info with her husband. All right. So we can learn a couple of lessons from this little girl. One, our testimony is important. All right. And God can use it definitely beyond circumstances and beyond ways that we can never imagine. We need to care about other people, whether they are our servant, all right, or whether they are our superior. And you can translate that into the workplace or social relationships. You know, I'm so grateful that early on in my work experiences, I had people who taught me that it doesn't matter who somebody is in the building at a school, that custodian is just as much a part of the education of children as the principal. And they deserve as much respect as the one who sits in the big front office.
Mhm.
So we see a lesson in that here. We need to care about others no matter what their circumstance is. We need to do what's right no matter what the outcome is. Now, I feel like this girl felt pretty confident in terms of what she was going to tell. But what if things hadn't gone the way she planned? She was still obedient.
The other word there is would, not could.
Yes. I think that's
Master
great.
would, he would hear.
And again, faith. Yeah, she's got amazing faith. She is grounded. Okay. Did the girl benefit? We have no idea. We don't see any indication at all that there was any benefit for her. Naaman benefited.
Because it got cured, probably went back.
Well, but we don't see that. We don't get any report of that. Okay, Joel, you're starting to say something.
I
Go.
was just thinking, after he watches, look at the change in name. I want a bag of dirt from here. This is where I'll work. Your God, which is also her God.
Yes.
There could be a benefit in that. And but other than that, we don't know of any.
Yeah, it's not recorded.
Yeah.
You know, is it?
But if
Go
you're-
ahead.
If you're imbuing him with a decent character at the 40.
Right.
Then effectively, she's living in a stable household, you know, and if he wasn't cruel to him before, then I doubt he's going to be cruel to him afterwards. She's got stability and at least a promise of him having a longer life than you would have otherwise.
That was the only thing I could think of, is that, you know, what happens if he dies? Does her situation suddenly get worse? Yeah, it's very likely. But I don't get an impression at all that that's what's motivating her. That would just be conjecture. So we have nothing other than the satisfaction of having been obedient to God and seeing God follow through. There's a joy that comes from seeing God deliver and uphold his promises. And I think based on the way that young girl phrased her statement about if only my master would see the prophet, he would cure him, I think she's going to gain that joy. Okay, so let's shift just a little bit and let's see what happens then after Naaman's wife shares with her husband. All right, so we're going to read verses 4-7. All right. So Naaman, obviously Naaman has heard at this point, went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. And his master is the king. Okay. By all means, go, the king of Aram replied. I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. I like the way he travels. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, with this letter, I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy. As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me? Okay, so again, remember who we're talking about with Naaman. We're talking about an Aramaic general who's revered by his king, who has gotten victories in the past, those that have been designated by God, victories designated by God. He's got leprosy and should be shunned. He's desperate. So he takes this information from this young girl and he goes to his king and asks permission to go. So he's following the chain of command. And then what does he gather? Money and goods. So what is part of what Naaman is relying on? What is it that Naaman is kind of relying on in order to get his healing? Wealth. So you see that there's reliance on wealth and power. He hasn't just set out and gone. And he's not in a circumstance where he's taking an approach other than what he knows. He knows what works in his world. The chain of command works, and he follows it. And he knows that connections work. And he knows how to facilitate connections. Now, I don't know about you, but I have some friends who are in the business world who have made some statements that always sound something like this. You don't know how business works. Now, y'all are laughing.
That's true.
Okay. Why is that true? Why are you laughing? What?
Until you get in, then each business is different.
Mm-hmm.
But until you get inside, just like, I don't know how public education works.
Mm-hmm.
But until you get inside and see it from, I guess, behind the scenes and see how things really are, you don't know how it works. Got an idea, but you don't.
Right. You hear about circumstances where certain actions are facilitated because of gifts that are made to particular people or organizations in order to get a desired outcome. We see that now. It's been something that we've seen for generations. And that's kind of what we see here. What is it going to take for me to get the desired outcome? So Naaman knows the way the world works. So he's got the letter from the king. So he's got the connections and he's got the wealth to be able to grease the wheels to get the outcome that he wants. What he's missing is what that little girl had. And that's the faith. So the last little character that I want to look at here is the king of Israel. Bless his heart. Verse 7. You have to look at the letter because the letter says, I want you to cure my servant of leprosy. You know, it doesn't say Elisha. Who is going to be responsible? Yeah, who's going to be responsible if Naaman comes back and isn't cured? The king of Israel. And he realizes the way the world works too. And what does it show you? Because he knows about Elisha. What does it show you about this king in terms of his actions? He tore his robes and said, am I God? Who is he relying on in order to make this happen? Himself. And that's not what the little girl said. It's Elisha. So we see even the king of Israel is relying on connections and what is the natural order of things. And he knows that the way the world works, he can't do this. What he doesn't have, he's missing the faith of that little girl. So y'all, are you looking and seeing here are two kings and a general, and they're all relying on connections and money. They're people at the top. Where's the faith coming from? The person at the bottom, the little girl. So we've got three instances now where we see God's not working from the top down. God's working from the bottom up. Okay. Now, 8 through 12, Naaman's next steps. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored and you will be cleansed. But Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. So verse 8, we see that God steps in and he's using Elisha just as he planned. And we also see Naaman's expectations. What do we see? Pride. Absolutely. You know, again, connections and money. And part of that connection is chain of command. There are expectations that Naaman has because of who he is. And the circumstances of his past. And he's willing to pay a lot to be healed. He goes to see Elisha. And what does he get? Does he see Elisha? I think that's the first little inkling. Verse 10, Elisha sent a messenger. He doesn't get to see the prophet. He sees basically a servant. from somebody who should know who he is. Why do you think Elisha does that?
But it's God who's going to carry it out.
There you go. Elisha, and we're going to see, Elisha doesn't want any of the trappings that will go with the miracle that's going to happen. He doesn't want the glory. He doesn't want the money. He doesn't want the 10 sets of clothes. He wants God to get the glory because God is doing the miracle. So the expectation that Naaman has is that this is a magic man who's going to come out and perform his magic. He'll pay him because that's the way the world works. But that's not the way that God works. And so Naaman's reaction, first, I think he's offended. And then he just gets downright angry. I mean, washing in the Jordan makes no sense. There's nothing magical about this, about these waters. He's got better rivers where he was. If Elisha didn't even come out and see him, he could have just stayed home. It's kind of like going to the doctor and you don't get to see the doctor. Well, I've had pretty good luck with physician's assistants, but there have been, there was one case where y'all know I have Graves' disease and it's in remission, but I was sent to an endocrinology practice and I never once got to see the doctor, never once. I got to see a nurse practitioner. And my first nurse practitioner was really good and knew her stuff. But she got married and moved. And bless her heart, I loved Allison. But I was sorry when she left because the person who came next was clueless. And as a matter of fact, got to the point and said, well, I don't really know much about Graves' disease. I do more with diabetes. And I thought, why am I seeing you? Because my expectation was that I was seeing someone who knew what they were talking about. And I did get mad and I did leave. So I'm no better than Naaman in some circumstances in that respect, but we weren't talking about a miracle God either. So anyway, but he's got his instructions and his top-down plan is not working because Naaman's reaction is to take his toys and start to head home. But verses 13 and 14, Naaman's servants went to him, and I love again, here's a picture of the household he's built. Naaman's servants went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you wash and be cleansed? So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. So what happens here? For the second time, we have servants that have approached the master, bottom up. And I love the way they do it. My father. So they obviously have care and concern for their master. There's respect. And they speak honestly. If it had been some big thing, you would have done that. So why not do this? Now, we don't get any indication about these people in terms of their faith, but we do get an indication of their relationship with Naaman. And so we have humility and obedience that finally comes into play with Naaman, because he listens to them and sets aside pride and says, okay. And that faith is rewarded, because the result to the obedience is the miracle without being in Elisha's presence. So 15 through 19 show us the real miracle. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him. Now he meets Elisha and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant. The prophet answered, as surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. If you will not, said Naaman, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other God but the Lord. But may the Lord forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I bow there also, when I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. Go in peace, Elisha said. All right, so he's healed. He understands the source of the healing. And what does he do that we saw also happen in the New Testament with one leper? He goes back and says, thank you. He goes back and says, thank you. The 9 left. The 1 went back. Naaman's heart is more like that 1 who knows the source of the miracle. And so 15 tells us the real impact in terms of the change in Naaman. We have change in his skin, but more importantly, we have change in his heart. And so the change in the heart is a direct result of the heart and the actions and the obedience of that young girl of faith from the bottom up. Now, we already talked about the reason that Elisha didn't take the gifts. He doesn't do this for the pay. He doesn't do this for the glory. He does it for the glory of God. So what lessons can we learn? God is sovereign. God knew. Now, we know there's a little part of the rest of the story, but it deals more with Naaman's servant, not Naaman's servant, with Elisha's servant after we leave here. But we don't know too much beyond about Naaman. But if he's a man of influence and a man of character, and people pay attention to him, I think people are going to notice and listen when he talks, when he goes home, and they see what's happened, and he tells them what's happened. I was reading an article that was talking about how we as a society, part of what's pulling us apart is we are actually so caught up in star power that we rely more on, or we trust more in fame in terms of being able to get things done and make things happen than we do in people who are people of character, hard workers. So they were talking about, in this article, they were talking about it in terms of politics and policy, and how name recognition goes so far. And they said, well, you know, is the only answer for us then to get people with name recognition who are people of character. You know, I don't know that I agree with all the premises in there, but I thought about Naaman and how he's got name recognition and he's a man of character. And he comes back and that character is now grounded in truth. And what kind of impact that had. I'd like to know about his servants. I'd like to know about his wife. But I have to think that there's a benefit that comes from that in terms of the influence he had, and that's a part of God's plan. So the affliction, the trial that he had could be a means of blessing to those, to himself and to those around him. I mean, because this is a man who's saved now. He knows God. He's saved. And that's the greatest gift of all and the greatest miracle of all. So we're going to leave Naaman. And don't forget that the change that has to happen from the bottom up. I see people in this room and on there who have done some great things. I don't see any kings. We do have a general. But God uses us where we are. So Joel, do you mind
No.
praying?
Heavenly Father, we just thank you. We thank you for the reminder that you are the God of this world. You are the Creator. And it's through you that you can work through us to use us in mighty ways for your kingdom and your glory. Lord, help us to be willing. Help us to be mindful for those times when you want to use us. We call it availability. Lord, help us to be available to you, to bring you glory and honor. Amen.
Amen.